All right, this is Chapter 1, Section 3, Civil War and the Home Front. All right, so up until now, we've been talking about the start of the war, the early battles of the war, um, but now we're going to be looking at not so much what's happening on the battlefields, but what's happening at the homes and the lives of the people not fighting in the war. So, a lot of thoughts and opinions in the South really differed about starting the war. Not all Southerners were supporters of the Southern states seceding or separating from the Union of the United States and conforming this new nation, the Confederate States of America. It's not like every single Southerner was in support of this. Many Southerners wanted peace, and they really, foresaw that this difficult task in forming a new nation, as well as trying to win a war against a superior force. So some Southerners thought this was just a terrible idea. That governors of individual states were hesitant to share soldiers and resources to other states. After the Confederate States kind of the Southern states broke away from the Union. The thought was that the states are going to be able to pretty much govern themselves, and then all of a sudden, this Confederate States of America nation was developed, and now they have to share everything. It's like, well, weren't they just doing that when they were part of the Union? So states wanted to be free to govern their own resources and not be under control by a strong federal government. And also, the Southern states, not coming together as a solid nation really contributed to the downfall of the Confederate nations. That notion, the whole reason why they founded is so they can have states' rights that we talked about. But that really was their downfall, because really a strong nation needs to be able to come together. But not a lot of Southerns thought that was what they wanted. So the divisions in the North about the war, many Northerners did not want to go to war with the South. They believed that, in the United States, that under the Constitution, that they had a right to separate from the Union if they didn't agree with the Constitution. Some lower class Northerners did not support the war and the Emancipation Proclamation and the freedom of slaves, because it freed the slaves, and the slaves would take, after they're freed, they're going to take their low-paying manual jobs. They're going to take their jobs away from them. So a lot of Northerners, didn't want that to happen. They didn't want, former slaves coming up to the North and taking their jobs and, menial jobs in factories and stuff like that. Also, there's some Northerners that opposed the war because they believe it was costing too many soldiers' lives. There's like such high death tolls in these battles that what are we doing here? Is this really being successful? Especially when the Union Army couldn't even find a successful general. So, a lot of Northerners found it hard to back such a war, when we had, such a trouble fighting it, especially in the early years. All right, so, desertion, which is the action of illegally leaving the armed forces. These soldiers in battle, after a few battles, desertion was a reality. It was a problem in both Union and Confederate armies. Remember, we talked about the reasons why joining is going to be adventurous and everything, but after living through some horrific battles, desertion was definitely a problem. It's like, oh, the luster, the adventure part of it kind of wore off. But also a lot of soldiers would desert or just up and leave their units because they would go home to plant and harvest their crops. Like that was their they were farmers. They had to do that. Um, you know, but when you deserted, most would leave without permission. They wouldn't even tell anybody. They just go. Like I said, after witnessing these horrible battles, a lot of soldiers just left, and they kind of lost their will to fight. Like, what are we doing? Like, their best friend died, the brothers died. Like, what are we doing? So they would desert. They would go home. Confederate soldiers by the end, were deserting in mass numbers. They saw, no one likes to stick around. It's almost like if you're at a Steeler game and the Steelers are getting just crushed, and it's the end of the, end of the fourth quarter almost. The time hasn't run out yet. Everybody just starts leaving. This is kind of how the Confederate soldiers felt. It's like, well, we're gonna lose, so might as well just leave. So that last like 6 months of the war, they were definitely just leaving in droves. But to stop desertion, the death penalty was enforced on any soldier that left without permission. And you can see in this picture, it was like death by firing squad. It was just a line of soldiers would fire at you. That would be the death sentence. So, a draft. So this is a system requiring people to serve in the military. It's a requirement. You have to go. Both the Union and Confederate armies used the draft to fill their armies. These armies were massive. You couldn't rely on just people volunteering. They needed a lot of soldiers. So they needed to force people into military service. At the beginning of the war, like I said, most were volunteers, but at the end, almost all were drafted. So in the Confederate Army, in 1862, the Confederate States, established this draft that all young men living in the Confederate States between the ages of 18 and 35 were required to serve in the military for 3 years. 3 years is a long time. The Union started off with only 1 year. But to make someone serve for 3 years, to survive 3 years of battle, that's a tough pill to swallow. They're asking you to survive, so that's, you have to be pretty lucky to survive 3 years of battle, military service. So that's tough. By 1864, they lost so many men. They were drafting males between the age of 17 and 50 years old to serve in the military. Avoiding the draft, the Southern avoiders, there was ways that you could not be drafted or kind of avoid from serving. If you owned 20 or more slaves, you were not required to fight. Confederate States government, they thought, well, if you have that many slaves, you should be around, you're producing a lot, so you need to stay there and make sure your slaves are working and producing for the Confederate States. All right. Or you could pay someone to go and serve in your place. Like, okay, hey, I was drafted, but hey, Joe, how about I'm gonna give you, $1,000, you serve in my stead. If you see a pattern here, both of these, if you own more than 20 slaves and you could afford to pay someone to go, you were wealthy. So if you were a wealthy Southerner, there was a chance you could avoid going to war. The same with North. If you paid the government $300, you didn't have to serve. If you were drafted and you're like, hey, I don't want to go, you give the government $300, you don't have to serve. But $300 back then was about a year's pay. You could also pay someone to go serve in your place. This kind of made, in both the North and the South, that this was a poor man's fight. Pretty much, the soldiers were poor males. They weren't, the wealthy type. They had to serve. They were drafted. And so no one likes to be forced to do anything, especially forced to serve in war and military to fight this war. So in July 1863 in New York City, where a lot of drafting was occurring because that's a high population, these massive, riots, this large mob, broke out, and that lasted for several days. And this was not a, small, riot. This was a large scale. They were destroying things. This is pretty much, they were really attacking rich people because, citizens of New York, they were tired of, the government, taking taxing them higher for the war, for, drafting, and these rich people were just getting rich off this war. So these riots, and this violent mob was formed in New York City, and lasted several days and destroyed so much property. And it's pretty much one of the biggest riots and mobs ever formed in the United States history. Union soldiers actually had come in and dismanned the mob. They had a fire upon the mob. They were so violent. I recommend clicking this link and watching this scene from the movie Gangs of New York that shows this just great depiction of the draft riots in 1863. All right, the economy during the war. The northern economy actually increased. They were doing well because they had all these factories, and the war provided the need for all these manufactured goods, such as guns, ammo, ships, you name it. So people had jobs. They actually didn't have that many workers to fulfill all these jobs, and so many were off fighting in the war. The U.S. government. Um, so everything was going well. There was plenty of work, but it did cost money to buy these goods from these factories. So they had to come up with this a way to pay for this war. So they actually established the first income tax during the Civil War. What an income tax is a tax on the money that people earn. The income tax is still in service today. So you get your paycheck, and the government automatically takes its tax, the federal tax of how much you make. The percentage is different depending on how much you make, but like everybody's paycheck, tax is taken out by the government, and really that's used to pay for goods and services. Okay, the southern economy did not do well during the war. Like I said, like the Anaconda Plan kind of surrounded the entire coast of the southern states, and it stopped them from selling any goods to anybody, any other country. They couldn't sell it to the north. The north wasn't going to support the southern economy, and so the only other option to sell to was other countries, England, France, but they couldn't because all the ships to go out were being blocked by the Union ships. So they're also, if you're not able to get goods out, you're not able to get goods in. So they were unable to receive goods from other countries, which drastically escalated the prices on the goods that they did have. If you don't have a lot of goods, the economy of supply and demand, if there's not a lot of a good and there's a high demand for it, the price goes up. The less of a good that is available, the higher price the good it is. So if you look at it, so there was not a lot of these goods because they weren't coming in or out of the South. There was a high demand for food and everything like that, so the price is really high. So what happened was, it's called inflation when the rise of prices on goods happen. When prices just skyrocket, things cost a little bit more every year, but when the prices drastically increase, that's called inflation. The South shortage of basic goods made the price skyrocket. When there's not a lot around, you can ask a lot of money for it. A pair of shoes in 1862 cost $18, but by 1864 it cost $800 because there was no factories to make these shoes. Where there was very few, so like they could charge a lot. A pound of beef in 1860 cost 12 cents. In 1860 it cost $9, just because the farmland was being destroyed by the Union Army. So there wasn't that much of it. What goods the individual citizens did have, a lot of it was seized by the government and given to the Confederate Army as supplies. So it was really, the people on the home front were really suffering. The Union's practice of destroying the farmland, like I said, contributed to the South's lack of good. When they destroy all this farmland, they would destroy just, if the Union were able to, they would destroy their factories. The South is just really cut off, and the supply of goods they had were just running out. So women's role in the Civil War, while the men of the family were fighting in the war, the women were left to manage businesses, farms, and plantations. They were pretty much left in the role to take care of the home front. Especially if the man died, then they permanently have to take care of the home front. Women had to take on both roles that they used to have, and now they have to take a role of their husband. Many worked in the fields themselves, planting and driving the teams of horses. There was a shortage of men that worked in the factories. Women were there to fill the void and perform dangerous work, such as making ammunition. So women just stepped right into those roles. While the men were fighting, they had to fill their roles as well as keep their roles as taking care of the family as well. Both the Union and Confederate armies enlisted women as spies to gather information on the enemy. women could just be, they were good spies. They could just be in the background and overhear something. They can report back. So a lot of them had that job, like the whole intelligence. There was no CIA back then, but this was definitely the beginnings of it. And then about 400 known cases, there probably was more, women that disguised themselves, that wanted to fight for their country. Uh, they disguised themselves as men, and then they fought for, either Union or Confederacy. Women's roles during nursing was a major new opportunity. Now we think like, even the stereotype isn't so much, but like nurses are, women. It really wasn't like that when it first occurred. It was mainly a predominantly male-dominated job. But during the war, all the males are off fighting in the war, so there was a need for all these nurses. So women were right there to fill this need. Both the Union and Confederate armies needed a lot of nurses. There was a heavy casualties, wounded soldiers, and they need people to take care of them. The nurses would set up these hospitals. They finally figured out to keep these soldiers alive, they need to set up these hospitals close to the battlefield, like these these tents, or they take, like, this is probably like some kind of, a lot of times they converted churches or people's houses into these hospitals. So they set them up so after when they take them from the battlefield, you don't have to go hundreds of miles to the nearest hospital. Hospitals are right there near the battlefield, and you can take care of them quickly. And the survival rate greatly increased because of that. The nurses, they were just so important, keeping these soldiers alive and keeping them, just saving these soldiers' lives, after their injuries. Some of them would even go onto the battlefield, like you would say, like, EMTs are like first responders. As soon as someone's injured, you call 911, they come right away, and they take care of you before you get to the hospital. Some of these women were kind of just like that. They were the paramedics. They would go straight onto the field and try to help you out right away to keep you alive. Clara Barton, known as the Angel of the Battlefield, she would do this. She would go onto the battlefield and take care of those soldiers. She founded the American Red Cross, after the Civil War, and which is an emergency disaster relief organization that is still around today. Like, Hurricane Katrina or any kind of hurricane and natural disaster, the American Cross is always there to provide that immediate aid, when something bad happens. All right, that concludes chapter 1, section 3. About home front of the Civil War.